Chapter 8. The Plan with No Escape. The leader who anticipates the failure of a bold plan and prepares for it will fail. In 2004 BC, the Chinese general Han Hissen led his army to a position near a camp of his enemy, the army of Zhao. Inside of the fortified camp, he aligned his army along the length of the riverbank, placing their backs to the deep, swift waters. Sun Tzu, in his classic The Art of War, relates that the soldiers of Zhao enjoyed a good laugh watching their enemies line up along the river. Then, almost immediately, the army of Zhao left its fortifications and attacked Han Xin's army. With their backs to the turbulent water, Han Xin's men fought so fiercely they overwhelmed the army of Zhao, put them to fight, and killed their king. After the battle, some of Han Xin's officers questioned his strategy. The general replied, "It is written, place your army in deadly peril and it will survive. Plunge it into desperate straits and it will come through safely. If I had not placed my troops in a position where they were obliged to fight for their lives, but had allowed each man to follow his own discretion, we would have suffered a rout." For 5 millennia, Chinese militarists have subscribed to the strategy of burning the boats and breaking the cookie pots, acts that told their armies, in effect, we have no plan B, we fight or die. My return to military analogies throughout the book is no accident. Many of my skills and attitudes about leadership originate from my years in the Army. At the same time, of course, I know a lot of tough-minded, high performers who never saw inside of a military base. I believe strongly in the need for discipline, which military training instills in individuals. Without personal discipline, we are little more than animals. A leader with a self-imposed code of discipline commands the high ground to impose discipline on others and to lead, whether platoons or corporations, by moral force. And make no mistake, much of being a high-performance superstar is leading yourself and others against the popular pap of conventional wisdom. Many of the strongest American presidents, Washington, Jefferson, Jackson, Lincoln, were tempered as young men in the fires of war. General Dwight Eisenhower built an enormous fighting force of uneasy allies, coordinated the advance of thousands on ground, air, and sea forces, and orchestrated victory on the cool beaches of Normandy. George Herbert Walker Bush was nothing more than a rich, preppy kid until he saw brave men die in war against dictatorship. Years later, the former Navy fighter pilots still had the resolve to craft an unlikely alliance of Americans, Russians, Arabs, and Israelis to crush the armies of another dictator, Saddam Hussein. In 2004, the elder former President Bush, still full of fight, celebrated his 80th birthday by making a successful parachute jump. Author's note: President Bush I, who I've had the pleasure of meeting, has since celebrated his 90th birthday, and I hope he celebrates his 100th birthday. End of author's note. The military trains you to be decisive, quickly to analyze information, and take action immediately. How else could I have made over 75,000 business decisions during my 37-year career? Author's note, that 37 years is now more than 45 years, and my business decisions approach 100,000. End of author's note. During the Civil War, Union General George McClellan looked and talked like a consummate leader to bring the North to quick victory. His men loved him. His Army of the Potomac was larger than the forces it opposed, but he couldn't bring himself to make the decision to fight. He acted as if he didn't believe in his own abilities to conduct war. In business, as I have said, you must act as if there are no limits to your abilities, and to that, you must act as if failure is not an option. In the late summer of 1986, I sent Charlie Soliday to New York with instructions not to come back without bridge financing for our deal to buy Bow Valley USA. He stayed 10 days and worked day and night negotiating with Citicorp, our bankers, bridging financing, and Solomon Brothers, the old line Wall Street brokerage firm, to underwrite the required loans. It was year's end. As with all major players in this industry, their plates were full with bigger fish than us. I knew they'd be listening to our proposal very carefully and watching us closely for heads of beads of nervous sweat. Investment leaders use intuition too, so our strategy was to act for an irrevocable position of incredible confidence. As the deal was virtually a given, the financing was a fairly standard proposition, and the chance to participate in the financing was a privilege, sweetened with the potential for enormous profit. Accordingly, Charlie calmly paid Citicorp $250,000 and Salomon Brothers $500,000 up front just to look at the deal. The money, which would become part of the overall fee if they handled financing, was non-refundable. Even in the 80s, $750,000 was an impressive sum and represented a huge portion of the cash for Great Western to lay out. Considering we only had about $1 million total in cash, and admittedly, this was a radical departure from the way I usually handle fees, but in desperate times, you got to do what you got to do. Imagine how those buttoned-down bankers, conservative by nature, perceived our level of confidence. Charlie had just pushed them to the table by handing them $250,000 in advance. Over at Salomon Brothers, meanwhile, we had gotten our attention as well. I can see them wide-eyed, rubbing their little palms greedily, saying, "This would be a hell of a deal for Penny to plunk down $500,000 in advance. We better take a look at it, at this cold deal. Look at the fat fee we might be missing now. Plus all those fees down the road. They must have been salivating on their pinstripes." But Charlie pushed even harder, acting as if he had no limits to his abilities. He told the bankers if they didn't act in 10 days, he was taking the deal to our bankers in the UK. 10 days, bye, boys, or kiss it goodbye. But our backs were to the river. We had no backup. Our bank in the UK, Sammy Montague, had already turned us down. We were fighting tooth and nail for the survival of this deal. Bluff worked, and we got the financing, $85 million in short-term loans from Citicorp, underwritten by a takeout commitment by Salomon Brothers, with bonds to be issued by early '87. The lesson is that you've got to plan for and expect success. This means no backup plans, no ripcords, no fail-safes, or you will fail. The finest high-wire acrobats working without a net. The only faint hearts are in the audience. In our opening tale, the Chinese commander knew that armies fight best on desperate ground, with no alternative. The hungriest salesman closes the hardest. Facing death, the concerned animal is the fiercest. Returning to the wisdom of Sun Tzu, the ancient strategist advises advancing generals not to press a desperate foe too hard or block a retreating enemy, for he will fight to the death against any attempt to bar his way and is too dangerous an opponent. Look for ways to make your people dangerous opponents when the stakes get high by creating for them and yourself a level of atmosphere of risk. This goes back to your comfort level for taking risks. No matter how many risks you take and how often, they're still scary. The only risks that aren't a little scary are the ones not worth taking. If you're experiencing no anxiety or occasional fear as you grow your business, the so-called risks you're taking are probably not worthy of you. Let's talk about dealing with fear. Fear and pain are related, and they're both signals that you cross the line beyond which your mind or body is not comfortable. Just as blister creates pain, risk creates fear. They're both natural, primal responses. The trick is to become comfortable in the presence of those responses. The athlete who learns to win regardless of pain has raised his or her comfort level to deal with the pain. Author's note: in recent years, I've used the analogy that the QLA mentees have to become comfortable with being uncomfortable. End of author's note. There's a story about T.E. Lawrence, known to history as Lawrence of Arabia. He and another British officer stationed in the Saudi desert talking about pain. Lawrence walked over to the candle to demonstrate his disdain for physical pain. He held his open palm over the flame until flesh reddened, then removed it. The other officer was astounded. "Doesn't that hurt terribly?" he asked. "The point is that it hurts," replied Lawrence. "The point is that you don't mind if it hurts." As a high performer, you must do the same with fear caused by risk. The fear never goes away. You just deal with it. and become comfortable in its presence. Does Dan Pena still feel a tinge of fear? Sure, but is he ready when it's time to fish or cut bait? Damn right. I've told people for years I was born ready. Author's note. As I read this in fall of 2016, having just turned 71, I still surprise people the amount of pain that I can endure, both physical and mental. End of author's note. But the reality is that I've trained myself by exposing myself to thousands and thousands of uncomfortable, even perilous situations, so I would be comfortable with my abilities when the testing time came. I'm not unique. High-performance individuals flourish in an atmosphere of conflict, crises, and trouble. In fact, progress often masquerades as trouble. As an aside, I avoid and detest the bastardization of the word challenge and opportunity as synonymous or euphemisms for trouble or problem. When some cheery-faced office moron chirps, "We've got a challenge to meet," I want to throw up. Did the captain of the Titanic waiting in the seawater discuss challenges and opportunities with the crew? Did Custer turn to his troopers at the Little Bighorn and say, "Man, with regard to arrows, we have a challenge this morning"? If you're in big trouble, have the respect for your executive staff to say so without having surrogate, "It is a challenge." We'll all talk more about conflict in a moment, but now let's examine the relationship of strategy and structure in a high-performance environment. I'm not talking about sharing doubts here. Keep your doubts to yourself. I'm talking about big problems that need stating up front, the solutions to be found. Strategy and structure, and which comes first? In the knowledge that unforeseen problems will arise to screw up the best laid corporate plans, let's discuss the utilization of two separate elements of company organization: structure and strategy. Structure describes the organized makeup of a firm's being, the form and nature of its existence. Evidence of structure includes such elements as the ubiquitous organizational chart and the chain of command, executive committees, individual job descriptions, typists, and posted in every cubicle, and the way things have always been done mentally. Structure requires no human thought to continue to exist. On a day-to-day basis, structure is a permanent framework within which every project, every potential for new revenue, every lurch forward must be filtered. Structure is immovable and inert. It becomes over time a temple of conventional wisdom and an impediment to quick, decisive action. A structure that may once have facilitated strategic planning and implementation now hinders and discourages it. And the larger the company, the more complex and intimidating the structure. In recent years, such corporate giants as Sears, GM, IBM have become classic examples of this truth. And of course, the federal government plodding through the paperwork and bureaucratic bullshit is the granddaddy of them all. Author's note: companies that have not replaced Sears, GM, and IBM, but have been added to the list are such as Microsoft, Google, and I predict even someday Facebook. End of author's note. Having said all that, we need to remember that structure itself is not inherently bad. Indeed, it is absolutely necessary in some form so that a company maintains a semblance of orderly operation. Strategy is entirely different. Almost the antithesis of structure. It requires thought to exist. Strategy implies movement toward an objective and it is fluid in nature. It is a plan created to propel and utilize people and resources efficiently, cost effectively, and especially profitably, whereas structure has no known origin but is framed and hangs in the lobby. Strategy has many sires and is scribbled in marker on a whiteboard. In too many companies today, strategy follows structure. Executives trying to develop strategy in pursuit of a passing opportunity must scramble through the gridwork of existing structures, seeking approvals, following form, and observing protocol. The aforementioned corporate entities, Sears and GM, are textbook examples of strategy following structure. During the mid-90s, this trend abated as companies returned to more flexible, more participatory management structures. At Great Western, I emphasize continually the dictum of structure follows strategy. We maintain a basic organizational structure, of course, CEO, 3 EVPs, mid-level management, etc. But as soon as we made the decision to take action on a project such as an acquisition and formulated strategy, we had the flexibility to remold structure and streamline it to meet the needs of the strategy. Job descriptions changed, procedures were compressed, and normal working hours became days, night, and weekends. When we were on more footing, we defined structure as whatever the hell it took to keep strategy on target and on schedule. And our target was winning at all costs. Even more importantly, structure in support of strategy enabled us to maneuver through crisis, to handle the ambush of unforeseen problem as quickly as it arose and move on. Thriving in conflict. Conflict is part of life. It is a natural phenomenon that results when people act in a pursuit of varying interests, priorities, and desires. Kids fight over toys, primitive tribes fight over territory, gangs fight over turf, companies fight over market share. Contrary to what mush-brained idealists would have you believe, conflict is not necessarily bad. Conflict weeds out losers while confirming the right of the superior to prevail. It is how conflict is managed or mismanaged that defines its quality. It's very evolutionary, almost Darwinian, how the doctrine of survival of the fittest reveals itself across the corporate landscape in the form of downsizing, mergers, and major consolidation. Business deals, especially at the high performance levels, distill and concentrate conflict because the stakes are so high. In global politics, when negotiations break down irreversibly, the parties can go to the war, since killing in war is not illegal. But in the business, the force of law and ethics, mostly law probably, discourage executives from physically harming one another to get their way. So the ultimate corporate arena for conflict resolution, short of legal action, is the negotiating table. Winning on your terms. Negotiating, like super success itself, is not for the touchy-feely. People who'd rather be loved than victorious invariably lose their ass at a negotiating table. As another high-performance oil man, J. Paul Getty, once said, "The meek shall inherit the earth, but not its mineral rights." Author's note, having never met Mr. Getty, but being around at the end of his tenure, I know he was a legend and I wish I had met him. End of author's note. I love the dynamics of negotiations. Skillful negotiators, of which I am among the best, are forceful, persistent, perceptive, and patient. I thrive on seeking out and defining my opponent's comfort zone. The imaginary box we discussed in Chapter 4, and then placing an offer on the inside rim of that comfort zone, closest to my own best interest. This delicate placement gives the doofus the absolute minimum he'll accept to close the deal and still be able to convince himself he won. And he really stuck to it, and he really stuck it to me. Negotiations is a poker game played with fortunes at stake instead of chips. To win, and this is key, you must make the other guys think that they want what you got more than you want what they've got. And in Kenny Rogers' words, you got to know when to hold them and know when to fold them. Negotiation is ultimate empowered play. Knowledge of your foe is your most powerful weapon, of course, and I maintain a full-time private investigator on the staff for exactly this purpose. But control of physical element of negotiation is also crucial. From the moment you enter the room, you want as much accumulated power as your side of the table as possible. Accordingly, I have 5 ground rules for people and myself entering the negotiation. 1, suits required. That seems obvious enough, but I've bargained against morons who wore their golfing suit attire to a morning session because they anticipated getting out of in time for an afternoon tee-off. You think Dan Penny adjusted his negotiating strategy to make sure that there was no golf that day until he had Dan's deal on Dan's terms? You bet. But beyond that, your custom business suit and power tie, even at 6 on a Sunday morning or 10 Sunday night, tells your counterpart that you came for business and a negotiation is your absolute top priority. A clown in a sports shirt tells me that he's got something else on his mind. 2, my place. Like any other contact sport, negotiations favor the home team. In my conference room, the familiar furnishings, the familiar feel of the chair beneath me, even the lingering aura of past victories won there, all contribute to my power level. By contrast, my adversaries are on unfamiliar ground. They are dependent on me and my staff for coffee and other amenities, and to tell them where the restrooms are. If I decide to tell them, when you're getting ready to hammer a negotiating opponent, before he realizes it, there's no place like home. 3, my contract. Always volunteer to draw up the contract. I'll go ahead and have my people draw up the contract. It's no problem. It seems innocuous enough to offer the courtesy of handling this detail, but now everyone will be beginning with your contract, the language your dream team lawyer has carefully, cleverly written to earn his equity. And you get a first and a longer look at what it says and how it reads. Enter negotiations with a perfect instrument from your perspective. So the burden is on the other side to find and recognize terminology and clauses not to your advantage. 4, nobody leaves until the deal is done. You tell your counterparts in advance that you expect the deal to be signed at the end of the upcoming negotiation meeting and for them to make whatever preparation required for a non-stop marathon. In fact, memo them to that effect. They'll agree because from the comfort of your own offices, they can't envision this type of meeting you're already mentally preparing for. 5, everyone necessary for the final definitive decision must be present at the meeting, or there's no meeting. It's like a salesman who must have the buying committee present in order to close a sale. If one executive is not able to attend the important negotiation where millions of dollars are at stake, one of 2 dynamics are occurring. The other party does not want to make a final decision and put ink to paper before the doors are unlocked, or a key player is revealing an attitude problem and by the absence is saying, I don't like this deal, I don't like you, and reserve the right to veto every decision and negate all the work invested in both parties. Either way, it's a negative force which must be resolved before serious negotiations can begin. With all the ground rules met, the other team arrives at, say, 9 o'clock in the morning. You greet them with friendly formality, offer coffee, and escort them to where you want them to sit. Then you buzz your assistant and instruct that no one accepting calls. You ask all present to turn off their cell phones, iPods, and other sources of interruption. You get up, go over to the conference room door, and lock it, saying, I know this is important for you as it is for us. Don't want to be disturbed, do we? How can they disagree? At the same time, message or memo about remaining in negotiations until the deal is consummated is starting to sink in. He means it. You have to make some allowance for potty breaks. After all, you did give them coffee. That's why the conference room of high performance companies have adjoining restrooms. But the point is that you expect no one to leave, not for another meeting, nor a golf at 3, or even for meals. When you thoughtfully order in handling the meeting in this way, you're exerting total power over these unsuspecting doofuses. Your place, your contract, your rules. The most successful negotiation is the win-win deal. That doesn't mean necessarily that both sides win, although this could be the case, as an apparent win-win means that each side believes he got enough of what he sought to declare victory. Of course, there is no real win-win situation. The illusionary phenomenon is a product of today's feel-good rhetoric dribbled from the lips of intellectual cream puffs who've never been there and done it. Negotiating styles range across a fascinating spectrum. We Americans, for the most part, except for Dan Pena, have a basic need to be accepted and maintains a low-key, patience-driven style. Most executives have been conditioned to be comfortable with a genuine win-win that results in everyone's parting filled with satisfaction and mutual respect, if not joy and love of all humanity. Because perception is reality, this occurs in theory, but rarely in reality. The other end of the spectrum is to stay brutal, abusive, and inflexible. Such negotiations frankly work on the premise, we win and take everything, you lose and get nothing. During the Cold War, U.S. negotiators played hopelessly by win-win rules against Soviet negotiators who wouldn't budge an inch. The Soviets were absolutists, meaning they would settle for nothing but absolutely everything. Their negotiations with fellow countrymen in Chechnya in 1995 and 1996 consisted of leveling whole cities and killing entire populations. This dichotomy of negotiating styles has always worked to our disadvantage and gave rise to the saying, before Vietnam, we never lost a war, nor won a peace. Today's equivalent are despots who rule China, North Korea, and Venezuela, Syria, and Iran, absolutists who only respect power and the will to use it. Iran will not accept Israel's right to exist until Israeli bombs reduce their nuclear facilities to a hole in the sand. If then, I am not a despot, but I don't mind being perceived as one in a negotiation with those starting with the usual win-win crap. Have someone on your team record the proceedings, or at least take thorough notes, especially on the details of the deal as they're hammered out. At the end of negotiations, or even at the end of the lengthy session, have those notes typed and printed out in hard copies for the two chief negotiators. It's amazing how people forget little negotiated points, especially concessions they've made in the heat of the moment. So memorialize your deal as your notes reflect, and leave a little space in the bottom of each page for you and the other negotiator to initial. Initialing such a memo shouldn't be a problem if verbal agreement has already been achieved. Say something like, this is pretty standard, we always do it this to protect both parties. Hell, sometimes I forget things myself. And read the memo first before you hand a copy to your counterpart, as if checking your accuracy. Then you initial your copy first and demonstrate your good faith. But then, what happens if they send you a contract later in which minor details have been changed? Send it back. They're testing to see how your resolve weighs against the desire to get the deal done and with no further delay. Send it back immediately. You might even attach a copy of the memo they initialed at the conference table, highlighting the item they tried to renege on or adjust. Don't let them weasel out on 1 percentage point, not 1 digit or dollar. Sometimes even your most adroit negotiating, your cleverest ploy will not dislodge a position taken by your opponent. If you can't agree to the point in the deal, say no. The proposal is unacceptable to us as it stands. If you can't work with us to solve the impasse, we'll have to break off negotiations. They'll call you on it by replying something like, at this point in the proceedings, we're not prepared to compromise on this particular issue, but we can talk about it some more at a later date. So without a word, you gather your papers, put them into your briefcase, and slam your briefcase shut. Your associates mechanically do the same. Then you look at their senior man in the eye and say, you can reach me through my office. You and your associates stand up and walk out. If you in your own conference room, you have left the other side to scratch their head in disbelief and find its own way out, or shown out by a secretary. If the meeting happens to be at their offices or their attorney's office, the worst place, it's even cleaner for you to just execute your walk out. Just remember, when you get outside, keep walking and never, never look back. They're watching you from the windows. Then you disappear from their day, giving them time and space to reflect on the stupid intransigence. The point is, don't be afraid to walk out. A dramatic exit is a killer because it's always unexpected. Just like those bastards did to Mark Harrison in Los Angeles, a lesser company than Great Western would have accepted defeat, but we wanted that deal. No, we needed that deal more than blood in our veins, and we did what it took to get negotiations back on track. Walking out is a tactic as surely as sitting with the back to the window so that the guys have to squint. By the way, never make an empty promise or an idle threat. Mean what you say, then do it without a blink, as if you've done it 1,000 times. If you say you're going to walk, you better damn well walk no matter what, or they'll never believe another word you utter again. Don't worry, you can always resurrect another day. I'm not going to get into the nuts and bolts strategy of successful negotiating. Those books have already been written. My message is learn to thrive in the conflict of negotiation. Know your foe, master your tactics, enjoy the poker game, and win no matter what happens. So create a plan with no safety nets, no escape. Make sure strategy drives structure, not vice versa. Learn to thrive in conflict and become a master poker player at the negotiating table. Now let's go to raise some capital.